Picture this. It's the summer of 1944. A German tank commander named Hans Fischer sits in a POW camp somewhere in rural Pennsylvania. He's still wearing what's left of his Wehrmacht uniform, and he's watching American trucks roll past the fence line. One after another, after another, after another. He turns to his fellow prisoner and says something that would be repeated by thousands of German POWs across America. Where do they get all of this? But here's the thing that really broke him. It wasn't just that America had a lot of stuff. It was that last week he'd been in combat in France. His Panzer unit had destroyed 3 American Sherman tanks in a single engagement. He remembered the smoke, the fire, the small victory in a losing war. And now, sitting in this camp, he was watching a trainload of brand-new Shermans roll past. Dozens of them, fresh from the factory, headed to the front lines. In less than a week, America had already replaced what his entire unit had spent months trying to destroy. "Das ist unmöglich," he whispered. "That's impossible." But it wasn't impossible. It was American industrial warfare. And today, we're going to tell you the story of how the United States pulled off the greatest production miracle in human history. A miracle so overwhelming that German soldiers literally couldn't believe what they were seeing. This is the story of how America didn't just win World War II on the battlefield. They won it in the factories, the shipyards, and the assembly lines. They won it with welders and riveters, with midnight shifts, and women in coveralls, with an industrial machine that moved so fast it made the rest of the world dizzy. Let's dive in. To understand why German POWs were so shocked, we need to go back a few years. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. America enters the war. And at this moment, the United States military is, well, let's be honest, it's kind of a mess. The U.S. Army ranks 17th in the world in size, 17th, behind Romania. The American military has about 175,000 active duty soldiers. For context, Germany has over 4 million men under arms. American tanks? They're using models from the 1930s that would be lucky to survive 5 minutes against a German Panzer. American planes? Outdated? American ships? Not enough of them. But here's what America does have. Factories. Lots and lots of factories. See, while Europe had been tearing itself apart for centuries, America had been building the most powerful industrial base the world had ever seen. By 1941, the United States produces more steel than Germany, Britain, and Japan combined. And when those Japanese bombs hit Pearl Harbor, something in the American psyche just clicked. President Roosevelt stands before Congress and essentially says, "All right, folks, it's go time." He sets production targets that sound completely insane. He wants 60,000 planes produced in 1942. His advisors tell him that's impossible. He tells them to figure it out anyway. And this is where the story really begins, because America is about to do something that will fundamentally change how wars are fought forever. They're about to turn war into a production problem. And if there's one thing America knows how to do, it's produce things fast. Germany built the best tanks in the world. They were engineering marvels, beautiful machines, each one carefully crafted. America built good enough tanks, and they built them so fast that it didn't matter if theirs weren't quite as good. Germany had better trained soldiers with more combat experience. America had more soldiers, and more bullets, and more planes, and more ships, and more everything. The Germans were fighting a craftsman's war. America was fighting an industrial war. And the Germans were about to learn a very hard lesson. In industrial warfare, speed beats quality every single time. So how did they do it? How did America go from the 17th largest military to producing more war material than the rest of the world combined in just a few years? Let's start with the factories. Before the war, America had car factories, appliance factories, and steel mills. After Pearl Harbor, they converted faster than you can say, Liberty ship. Ford Motor Company, yeah, the guys who made your grandpa's sedan, they retooled their entire operation in months. The Willow Run plant in Michigan became the largest aircraft factory in the world. This single factory was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at its peak. Every 63 minutes. Think about that. A 4-engine heavy bomber with thousands of parts rolling off the line faster than you can watch a TV show. But here's where it gets really wild. Henry Kaiser, a guy who'd never built a ship in his life, decided he was going to revolutionize shipbuilding. The old way of building ships? Took about a year per vessel. Kaiser said, "That's too slow." He introduced assembly line techniques to shipyards, prefabricated parts, welding instead of riveting. He turned shipbuilding into a connect-the-dots operation. The result? Liberty ships rolling out in an average of 42 days. The record was set by the SS Robert E. Peary. Built in 4 days, 15.5 hours. 4 days. The Germans would spend months building a U-boat. America built 3 cargo ships in the time it took Germany to launch 1 submarine. But factories don't run themselves. You need people. Lots of people. This is where things get really interesting, and where a lot of women enter our story. With millions of American men shipping overseas to fight, who's going to build all these tanks and planes? Enter Rosie the Riveter. And no, that's not just a poster. That's millions of real women who walked into factories and said, "Teach me how to weld." By 1943, women make up about 65% of the aviation industry workforce. They're riveting bomber fuselages, assembling tank engines, and working the night shift at steel mills. There's a woman named Naomi Parker Fraley. She's the real inspiration for that famous Rosie poster. She's working at a naval air station in California, operating a lathe. A photographer snaps her picture. That image becomes the symbol of an entire generation of women who kept the war machine running. And these women were good. Really good. There's a story about a B-17 assembly line in Seattle. The male workers had been struggling to install a particular component in the bomber's tail section. It was cramped, awkward work. Then a woman named Betty McDonald, she was barely 5 feet tall, volunteered to try. She crawled into that tail section and had the component installed in half the time. After that, the supervisors specifically requested smaller women for the tight space work. The Germans? They never fully mobilized their women for factory work. It was ideologically uncomfortable for the Nazi regime. They wanted women at home, not in factories. That decision probably cost them the war. Now let's talk about how these factories actually worked, because this is where American innovation really shined. You know Henry Ford's assembly line, the one that made cars cheap and available to everyone? America took that concept and applied it to everything. Tanks used to be built like custom cars, each one slightly different. Skilled craftsmen working for weeks. America said, "No thanks." They broke down tank production into tiny, repeatable steps. A worker didn't build a tank. They installed one bolt, the same bolt, 1,000 times a day. Sounds boring, right? But it was brilliant, because now you could train someone in a few hours instead of a few months. And you could build tanks faster than anyone thought possible. The M4 Sherman tank, probably the most famous American tank of the war, they built about 50,000 of them. 50,000. For comparison, Germany built about 6,000 Tiger tanks. The Tiger was a better tank, no question. Thicker armor, bigger gun, more powerful. But when you've got 50,000 Shermans and the other guy has 6,000 Tigers, the math gets real simple, real fast. There's a phrase American tank crews used, 5 Shermans for every Tiger, meaning it took about 5 Sherman tanks to reliably take out 1 Tiger. The Germans thought this was a winning ratio for them. They were wrong, because America had 15 Shermans for every Tiger. They could lose 5 and still have 10 more coming up the road. But here's something people don't talk about enough. Building the stuff is only half the battle. You've got to get it where it needs to go. And this is where America really flexed. The U.S. built a logistics network that would make Amazon jealous. They were shipping tanks from Detroit to North Africa, planes from California to England, medicine from New Jersey to the Pacific Islands. They built roads, railways, and ports at a pace that seemed superhuman. In England, they constructed entire airfields in weeks. In the Pacific, they'd take an island, and within days, not weeks, days, they'd have a functioning airbase. The Germans were still using horses, like actual horses. About 80% of German supplies in the Soviet Union were moved by horse-drawn carts. Meanwhile, America was airdropping supplies to soldiers in the jungle. The contrast was staggering. Let me tell you about a moment that really captures this whole story. It's June 1944. D-Day has just happened. Allied forces are pushing inland from the beaches of Normandy. And there's this German tank commander, we'll call him Werner because his real name is lost to history, who's positioned his Panther tank in a defensive position near Caen. Over the course of a single day, his crew knocks out 7 American Shermans. 7. Werner is exhausted, but satisfied. They've done their job. They've held the line. Then the next day comes. And there are more Shermans, not 7, dozens. And the day after that, more Shermans. Werner's crew manages to survive another few days, destroying more Allied tanks. But eventually they're overwhelmed, not by better tactics, not by better equipment, but by sheer numbers. When Werner is finally captured and taken to a POW processing center, he sees something that breaks his brain. Hundreds of brand-new American tanks on railroad cars, all heading toward the front. He turns to the American soldier guarding him and asks in broken English, "How many tanks does America have?" The GI shrugs and says, "More than we need." That answer haunted Werner for the rest of his life. Or consider what happened to the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Early in the war, the Luftwaffe was the most feared air force in the world. Their pilots were experienced, their planes were excellent, and their tactics were refined. But then America entered the war, and the math changed completely. The U.S. Army Air Forces started producing planes at a rate that made German commanders think their intelligence reports were wrong. In 1942, America produced about 48,000 aircraft. That's not a typo. 48,000 planes in 1 year. By 1944, American factories were producing more planes in a single month than Germany produced in a year. There's an account from a German fighter pilot named Franz Stiegler. He describes flying his Bf-109 over Germany in 1944, trying to intercept American bombers. He shoots one down, feels the brief flash of victory. Then he looks up, and there are 300 more bombers in the sky. 300, all in formation, all heading to bomb his homeland. He later wrote, "We were killing ourselves trying to stop them, and it meant nothing. For every plane we shot down, 5 more appeared. It was like trying to stop the ocean with your hands." The psychological impact of this was devastating. German pilots knew that every time they took off, the odds were worse. Not because they were becoming worse pilots, but because America was producing pilots and planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. Now, let's not paint this as some bloodless production miracle. Real people died making this happen. Factory accidents were common. Women and men working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, exhausted, handling dangerous machinery. Mistakes happened. There's a story from a bomber plant in San Diego. A woman named Sarah Chen was working on an engine installation when a hoist cable snapped. The engine fell. Sarah pushed a co-worker out of the way and took the impact herself. She didn't survive, but her co-worker did. And that co-worker finished the war, went home to her kids, and lived to be 89 years old. The people building these machines weren't just workers, they were part of the fight. They knew it, and they accepted the risk. Across America, factories had these boards showing production numbers. This week we built 127 tanks. That's 127 more than the enemy. It was personal. When your brother is fighting in Europe and you're building the plane that might cover him, you work faster. You work harder. Meanwhile, back to those POW camps in America. By 1945, the United States was holding about 425,000 German and Italian POWs on American soil. And these camps weren't on the front lines. They were in places like Texas, Oklahoma, and Idaho, right in the middle of American farm country. The POWs worked in fields, helped with harvests, and generally got a front row seat to American abundance. For many German soldiers, this was the first time they'd seen America with their own eyes. And it shattered the propaganda they'd been fed. They'd been told America was weak, soft, divided. Instead, they found a country where even the prison camps had better food than German soldiers had been eating at the front. There's an account from a German POW named Reinhold Pabel. He was held at a camp in Illinois. He later wrote about his experience. We were told before capture that America was struggling, that their people were starving because of the war effort. Then we arrived in America and saw more food in the camp than we'd seen in years. The guards were eating steaks. We were eating better than we had in the German army. But the real shock came from seeing the production. POWs working near factories would watch trucks and tanks roll past in numbers that seemed impossible. They'd been told German industry was superior, that German engineering was the best in the world, and maybe it was. But America had something better than the best engineering. They had enough engineering, and enough was winning the war. Let's talk about D-Day for a minute, because this is where American production power reached its peak. Planning for the Normandy invasion required more equipment than any military operation in human history. They needed 5,000 ships, thousands of landing craft, tens of thousands of vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, mountains of supplies, and they needed it all ready by June 1944. American production delivered. On D-Day, Allied forces landed with overwhelming material superiority. The Germans had better positioned defenses, more experienced soldiers, and the advantage of defending. But the Allies had more of everything else. After the initial landing, the supply chain kicked into high gear. Within days, artificial harbors called mulberries were operational, allowing massive quantities of supplies to flow onto the beaches. A German officer captured during the Normandy campaign later described watching the Allied supply operation. We knew we had lost when we saw the supplies. It never stopped, day and night. More trucks, more tanks, more artillery. We were rationing ammunition. They were wasting it. That word, wasting. It's important. The Americans could afford to waste ammunition. They could afford to waste supplies, because they had so much more coming. Or consider the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Hitler's last major offensive in the West. The Germans punched through the American lines in the Ardennes, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. For a moment, it looks like the Germans might actually pull off a miracle. Then American production kicks in. Eisenhower needs reinforcements. He needs them now. Within 48 hours, entire divisions are being redirected. Supplies are flowing. The weather clears, and American planes fill the sky. The German offensive, which had relied on capturing American fuel supplies, stalls. Why? Because the Germans had calculated that the Americans couldn't resupply their forces fast enough. They were wrong. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition were rolling 24/7. The Red Ball Express, a supply convoy system, was delivering 12,500 tons of supplies to the front every single day. By January 1945, the bulge was gone. The German offensive had failed, not because of lack of courage or tactical skill, but because they couldn't sustain it. Meanwhile, American forces had more supplies after the battle than they'd had before it started. And we can't talk about American production without mentioning the Pacific. This was a war fought across an ocean, islands separated by thousands of miles of water. Japan had been preparing for this kind of war for decades. America had about 6 months to figure it out, and figure it out they did. At the start of the war, Japan had a superior navy. Their ships were better designed, their sailors more experienced, and their admirals more skilled. By 1944, none of that mattered. American shipyards were producing aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines faster than Japan could sink them. There's a stat that really captures this. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, America lost the carrier Yorktown. It was a devastating blow. By 1945, America had more carriers in the Pacific than Japan had major surface ships left afloat. The Yorktown was replaced, then replaced again. Then replaced again. Japan never recovered from their losses at Midway. Every ship they lost was irreplaceable. By 1945, the production advantage had become so overwhelming that the war's outcome was inevitable. Germany was producing about 1,000 tanks per month at their peak. America was producing 2,000. Plus all the trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and everything else needed to keep an army moving. German factories were being bombed around the clock. American factories were running 3 shifts, hiring more workers, and expanding. There's a moment that really captures the end. April 1945, as Soviet forces are entering Berlin, a German general named Heinrici is captured by American forces. He's brought to an interrogation center. The American intelligence officer asks him when he knew Germany would lose the war. Heinrici thinks for a moment, then says, 1943, when we realized America was producing more in a month than we could produce in a year. The battle was over. We just didn't know it yet. So what did this do to the German soldiers and POWs who witnessed it? It broke them, not physically. The Americans generally treated POWs well, but psychologically. Everything they'd been told about the war was a lie. They'd been told they were fighting for a superior civilization, that German engineering, German discipline, and German will would overcome American weakness. Instead, they found themselves overwhelmed by a country that treated war like a production problem and solved it with the same efficiency they used to make cars and refrigerators. There are dozens of accounts from German POWs expressing the same sentiment, disbelief. One POW captured in Italy in 1944 wrote home. His letters were censored but preserved. I do not understand how we thought we could win. The Americans have everything, everything. And what they don't have, they make, faster than seems possible. Another captured in France. They replace their losses before we can count them. It's not war, it's industry. And maybe that's the most profound realization. Modern war had changed. It wasn't about the bravest soldiers or the best generals or even the smartest tactics. It was about production capacity, logistics, supply chains. The country that could produce the most, transport it the fastest, and sustain it the longest, would win. Germany thought they were fighting a warrior's war. America fought an industrial war. This changed everything about how countries think about warfare. After World War II, every major military in the world started thinking about war in terms of production capacity. The Cold War became, in many ways, a production race. The Soviet Union tried to match American production. They couldn't, not quite. China watched and learned. Their entire modern military strategy is built around the lesson America taught in World War II. Industrial capacity wins wars. And it's not just military. The techniques developed during the war, assembly line, production, just-in-time logistics, quality control systems, these became the foundation of modern manufacturing. Your smartphone exists because of lessons learned building B-17 bombers. Amazon's delivery system is a descendant of the logistics networks created to supply armies across oceans. The modern world is built on the infrastructure of American wartime production. But let's bring this back to the people, because at the end of the day, this wasn't about factories or machines or production numbers. It was about millions of ordinary people who decided to do something extraordinary. the women who left their homes to work in factories, the engineers who redesigned everything to be faster, simpler, cheaper, the workers pulling double shifts, the truck drivers hauling supplies, the welders, the riveters, the assembly line workers. Nobody was a superhero. They were just people doing their jobs. But collectively, they created a miracle. There's a woman named Augusta Clausen. She worked at a shipyard in Oregon. She kept a diary during the war. In one entry from 1943, she writes, "Today, we launched 3 ships. 3. I worked on one of them." Somewhere in the Pacific, sailors will use that ship to bring supplies to our boys. Maybe my brother. Maybe someone else's brother. But because of what we did today, they'll have what they need. That's why we work so hard. That's why we keep going when we're tired. Because it matters. That diary entry captures everything. It mattered. Every rivet, every weld, every tank that rolled off the line. It mattered. So what can we learn from this story? First, speed matters. In war, in business, in life, being good enough today beats being perfect tomorrow. The Sherman tank wasn't the best tank, but it was good enough, and there were enough of them. Second, never underestimate collective effort. None of the individuals building these machines were extraordinary. But millions of ordinary people working together? That's unstoppable. Third, innovation isn't always about new technology. Sometimes it's about applying old technology in new ways. Henry Kaiser didn't invent welding. He just applied it to shipbuilding in a way nobody had thought of before. And finally, maybe the most important lesson, free people working toward a common goal can accomplish miracles. The American War production miracle wasn't just about factories and assembly lines. It was about a society that said, we need to do this, and then figured out how. It was messy. It was chaotic. There were mistakes and inefficiencies and problems. But it worked. Today, when you drive past an old factory building, maybe one that's been converted to lofts or offices, take a second to think about what it might have been. Maybe it built planes, or tanks, or ships. Maybe your grandmother worked there, welding bomber fuselages on the night shift. Maybe someone's great-grandfather loaded those tanks onto trains headed east. These stories are fading. The people who lived them are almost all gone now. But the lesson remains. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they work together. The German POWs couldn't believe how fast America replaced its tanks and planes. But they learned, and the world learned. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn it again. Because right now, we face challenges that seem impossible. Climate change, disease, inequality. But we're the descendants of the people who built 50,000 tanks while the rest of the world said it couldn't be done. We're the descendants of the women who said, teach me to weld, and then built the planes that won the war. We're the descendants of the people who took the impossible and made it routine. So when someone tells you something can't be done, when they say the problem is too big, the timeline too short, the challenge too great, remember the story of American war production. Remember the German POWs watching train after train of tanks roll past, whispering, impossible. Remember that impossible is just a word. And words don't build tanks. People do.